We are going to move on now to our next presenter for today's session. And we are lucky enough to be joined today by Leon Rowlands. Leon's from Switchback Consulting, and he's going to share his experience working in the erosion sediment control space over the last 25 years, particularly around compliance programs in Queensland that have set foundations for statewide policies on erosion sediment control. Now, I know that Leon has a bit of a passion for being in the water, as well as working to improve practices in the development sector that affect the quality of the water. So he's got a personal interest in this one. Thank you, Leon. Take it away.
Okay, thanks, Belinda. So I'm an environmental and civil engineer, and today I'm going to be discussing how to implement a successful erosion and sediment control compliance program. So the key elements that I think you need to know to be able to produce a successful ESC program is knowing what good practice erosion and sediment control actually looks like, understanding the key elements required to implement good ESC, knowing how to create the right culture in industry and government for good erosion and sediment control to thrive, and also understanding what tools and resources are available to help in that journey. Okay, so most of you wouldn't know me, so why do I care about water issues? Well, I grew up in a farm near Lismore in northern New South Wales. My childhood saw two large floods that I witnessed firsthand and really impressed on me the power and how closely our lives are linked to water. I also spent a lot of time helping my dad restore creeks on our farm, which were degraded by generations of dairy farming, as well as swimming in waterholes and catching crayfish and eels, something my kids still enjoy doing today. Today I live on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, where I enjoy surfing, fishing and jet skiing with my family, and where I've managed to make a career out of water-related activities. I set up and ran the ESC compliance program for Sunshine Coast Regional Council, which is one of the largest and highest growth council areas in Australia. And I've also assisted a number of other Queensland councils with establishing their own programs. Okay, so what does good practice ESC look like? First, I have a guilty secret to confess. Until I was about 30 years old, I'd never really seen erosion and sediment control done well. I'd read the manuals, I'd done the training, but I'd never really seen it implemented well in real life. And after all the failures that I'd seen, I really doubted that what I'd read in the manuals was even possible. What changed for me was I was lucky enough to work with an old guy from New South Wales who had been a regulator down there and had seen ESC done well in that jurisdiction and had this unwavering conviction that could also be done well in Queensland. And that conviction was the catalyst for me and others to really start demanding improvements and putting in place systems and processes to support better outcomes. I'm guessing that some of you at least will probably be in a similar position to the 30-year-old version of me. So I wanted to just take you through some pictures of what best practice actually looks like. And these are the things that are now, if not common, at least accepted practice in Queensland. So I was going to talk about stabilisation first of all, and it was reassuring in Kathy's speech that she focused on how important stabilisation is. I definitely agree with that. I think it's the most important, but probably still the least well done aspect of erosion and sediment control. Engineers like me love to focus on drains and sediment basins and building things, but getting cover on soil is really the critical thing, and it's something that still needs improvement on. In this picture though, you can see what is happening more and more, which is progressive stabilisation. So in this photo, we've got bulk earthworks having been completed, and the civil and road construction is still yet to start, but rather than wait until that's completed to start doing stabilisation, they've actually come in and stabilised all of the lot areas that are at finished level at the end of this bulk earthwork stage, which is very positive to see. These are some close-up images of the same kind of outcome on different sites. Again, got good grass cover having been established over bulk earthworks areas at finished level, even though we've got the road construction yet to start. Same sort of thing here. Here we've got bulk earthworks still occurring around the edges, but the areas that are at finished level being progressively stabilised. The same thing here, where you've still got a lot of bulk earthworks to go, but they're not even waiting to the end of bulk earthworks. They're progressively stabilising, getting the topsoil back and grass established as finished levels are reached in each area. And one thing we were very successful with was, even if you're not getting progressive stabilisation, at least holding the line at the end of construction before titles are released and land's able to be sold, and making sure that everything is stable at that point, because at least all the sediment export comes to an end at that point if you can achieve that stabilisation. It's not just lot areas. This is some images where you've got extensive batters which drain away from sediment basins. You can't physically get them back to sediment basins due to the retained vegetation or riparian corridors. And here we can see that they're actually implementing the final landscape solution, which is mulch and jute mesh with plants still to go in. And they're doing that while they're still doing earthworks and civil works in the rest of the site. So there's no reason why landscaping works can't be brought forward like that. It's just that it requires a bit of commitment and coordination from the contractors. It's another example of the same thing. So we've got the final landscaping mulch on that external batter, even while earthworks are still occurring on the rest of the site. Something else that's used more and more in southeast Queensland is use of soil binders. Spray-on binder, which is based on a PVA glue, basically, which holds the soil together. And this is useful as a temporary form of stabilisation. So you might have an area that's not at finished levels yet, but it's going to be on hold for a period of time. It may not be able to drain back to a basin. So you can use a binder for those areas of sheet flow. And here they've also got geofabric and rock check dams in the concentrated flow area as well. Drainage. So drainage is pretty critical, particularly when it comes to management of external catchments and clean water. So although the water looks a bit dirty in this, it's more because of the sky colour. This is a clean water catchment being diverted through a construction site, while some channel works were actually happening on the main flow path. So quite a bit of effort going into diverting the external catchment and making sure it stays clean. This is an image of a haul road grading down to a creek. And so often you'll see these as just bare dirt, bare table drain, or no table drain, and you can get massive amounts of erosion on these sorts of haul roads leading directly to waterways. In this one, they've established a crossfall and a stable table drain on each of the approaches to the creek, as well as a gravel surface, so really reducing the sediment load getting to the creek. Other drainage features: having good, well-constructed chutes to get water down batters, having well-constructed drains to get water to sediment basins, so dirty water drains to basins. Well-constructed drain won't blow out or fail, so you'll actually get the water going to the basin. And another example of a well-constructed drain. Sediment control. Something that's not always sort of a sediment control is good construction entrance, but that's a really key thing to stop the sediment being tracked onto roads. And vibration grids and well-constructed entrances are a pretty standard feature these days, but weren't always the case. Sediment basins is an interesting one, and I'd say after sediment basins are quite a visible feature of a construction site, and I think that was a pretty early success, was getting sediment basins constructed. What we started to realise once we had basins being routinely employed on construction sites was that they seemed to be discharging quite frequently, and we kind of questioned how effective these actually were as controls. And that led us to do some work and starting to innovate with looking at improving the amount of water actually able to be treated by sediment basins. So a traditional sediment basin is managed as a batch process. It fills during a rainfall event, then it's treated with a chemical flocculant or coagulant, and then is manually dewatered. And that process is actually really inefficient. And we found that even operating them ideally in southeast Queensland, you'd only manage to capture about 40% of the annual average runoff volume by doing that process. And many of them certainly weren't operated ideally, so it was even lower than that figure. And this led Sunshine Coast to start experimenting on some of their landfill sites, and with other companies on the Sunshine Coast, we sort of progressed things to develop a new approach, which was high efficiency sediment basins. And they're based on a continuous treatment process rather than a batch treatment process. So the basins stay full and water is treated as it comes in and achieves clarity as it gets towards the end of the basin. And these basins, being the same size as the traditional basins, are able to treat closer to 80 to 90% of the annual average runoff volume. So that's been a big technical engineering improvement, I guess, over recent years, and that has been enshrined in Queensland legislation now as the best practice expectation. Here's a few more images of those high efficiency sediment basins. So they comprise a couple of different cells. There's the forebay at the closest to the screen, where a lot of the mixing takes place, and then there's a weir or a level spreader which helps to spread the water over the full width of the basin, and then it achieves a tranquil flow towards the outlet weir so that the sediment can settle out. Another view of a high efficiency sediment basin. All these images are high efficiency basins because there really aren't that many traditional basins anymore. And you can see that there's a couple of containers of the flocculant chemical at the front, and it's hooked up to a pipe which measures the incoming flow rate and applies the appropriate dose of the chemical. And you can see in the back cell, furthest from the front of the screen, the kind of clarity that's achieved before discharge. This image is just to show what can be achieved with some commitment in terms of implementing a sediment basin. So never accept the argument that they can't put a basin on the site. This is a really steep site with a huge amount of earthworks occurring, and they've managed to construct these well-built stable drains around the perimeter of the earthworks to get all the water back to a single place for the sediment basin. And then in the gully, you can see that a 2-cell high efficiency basin has actually been built on this really steep terrain, and is achieving good discharge. And this last image of a sediment basin is showing the discharge. This is from an active construction site, again a high efficiency sediment basin, and you can get a feel for the kind of clarity that's actually achievable with these kinds of systems. Okay, so how do you actually achieve a system which will deliver those kind of erosion sediment control outcomes? I think there's 4 really key aspects to getting good outcomes. One is having a good erosion sediment control plan, which identifies all the controls that are necessary and also steps through each of the phases in construction. It's very often you'll just have a single ESC plan, even though levels may change significantly and the discharge point for catchments may vary during construction. So you really need to put some effort into planning up front. The second aspect is a competent contractor who is actually has the skills to implement that ESC plan. The third is adequate budget and program for that contractor so they can actually be successful. They need to have the funds to actually do the work that's required, provided by the developer. And the fourth element is a regulator that will enforce compliance. And from my experience, if you're missing any one of those elements, you will not have a successful outcome in terms of erosion and sediment control. All 4 are really critical for success. Okay, so how can government create a culture within industry where these critical elements can actually thrive? The process itself is actually really simple, and the key, I believe, is thinking of ESC in terms of a behaviour management exercise rather than solely a technical exercise. So the key steps in any behaviour management exercise are to firstly set clear expectations, secondly provide industry with the tools and the training necessary for success, so we call that scaffolding, and three, making sure that you apply consequences if those expectations aren't met. So probably anyone who's got small children can relate to all three of those. So how do we set expectations? In the long term, ideally, you would have a clear line of sight between legislation, policy and guidelines, so that those expectations are really clearly spelled out. That can take a long time, and there needs to be the right opportunities to update those high-level documents, but that's something that should probably all work towards. But in the short term, so you're not waiting for years, approval conditions that go on development permits can set up good erosion set control outcomes, and it's most likely that most jurisdictions will have some high-level heads of power that would allow that to occur. So how do I come up with some ESC conditions? This document's been recently produced by Water by Design in Queensland, part of Healthy Land and Water. And that includes a number of tools for design for local governments, and one of them is a set of erosion sediment control standard conditions. One question you may have is, why do we need a whole heap of standard conditions? Why can't we just have a simple condition that refers to the national guideline, to the IECA best practice ESC guideline? I'd argue that IECA is a how-to manual, not a policy, and it simply does not succinctly communicate required outcomes. It contains 66 fundamental principles, 250 suggested standard conditions, many of which are not measurable or enforceable. It really has everything on an equal importance or priority footing, whereas we know that some things are definitely more critical than others, and it provides multiple options for erosion and sediment control standards. So it's really been clear to me from many conversations with both contractors, compliance officers and assessment officers over many years that there isn't a clear common understanding of what best practice ESC actually looks like, or what the IECA manual requires in a holistic sense. So that Water by Design document and the conditions therein really seek to address this by providing an outcome-based condition, which is based on the principles in IECA, but states it in a succinct, measurable and enforceable way. In addition, the Water by Design document also has some suggested process conditions, which aren't critical, but they're provided to try and guide the process that developers and contractors should be following to be successful. So it's really trying to assist them to have a good framework in place. And it outlines requirements such as submission and certification of erosion and sediment control plans, attendance at pre-start meetings, and requirement for independent audits for some high-risk sites. So how do we help industry to become more capable? So how do we build their capacity? I think the best way, the most effective way of building capacity is for the regulator to actually get out on site and be providing audits and feedback, discussing those things. It does require that you've got the staff to do that and that they actually know what they're talking about. But if you can do that, it builds relationships and it also helps to build understanding. And if you're deciding that you want to do an ESC compliance program, probably the worst thing you could do is go out tomorrow and start issuing fines or enforcement notices. You really need to go through that period of building capacity, building common understanding, and then gradually transition towards enforcement. So that's a very critical thing. Time consuming, labour intensive, but very effective if you can do it. In addition, you can look at guidelines. There is the IECA national guideline, which is very good from a technical perspective, just not so much in terms of actual policy, I think. but there might be South Australia specific aspects that you want to build in. So you could look at funding guidelines, but there is a lot to build on already. And training, although there's no obligation on government to provide training for industry, I think it builds a lot of credibility if you're looking to move into a compliance space, that you do first offer those training opportunities to help upskill industry. You may find if you do that people don't take up the training until you start moving into a more of an enforcement footing, and then the demand will increase, unfortunately. And finally, we come to applying consequences. This is the most important and also the most difficult part, unfortunately, and this is where most regulators, most local governments really fall down. They're good at producing policy and not so good at actually following through with consequences. So to be able to do this, you really need to have the right culture in your organisation, which is not a simple matter. You need to have an apolitical environment for those enforcement personnel. So if your mayor is going to pull things back every time his mate Dave rings up and complains about an ESC inspector on his site, then it's probably not worth trying to do an ESC program, because if you can't do effective enforcement, then it's not going to go anywhere. You need to be resourced with enough staff to actually do the regulation. Some is better than nothing, but you need to look at how many sites you need to get around and make sure you've got the staff to do it. You need to ensure that those staff are skilled and are able to undertake proportional enforcement. So that means not issuing fines and enforcement notices for relatively trivial or administrative problems, but also not taking a really lenient approach towards things which are major and will lead to proper environmental harm. And you also need staff which are really committed to achieving a good outcome, because it is a tough job and it will be political at times. So some of you might be wondering, my organisation doesn't really sound like an organisation that can do regulation. How might we move it more towards that kind of culture? Again, Healthy Waterways have produced a bit of a tool and a guideline to help create an action plan to create that sort of internal process and culture, and it goes through a number of steps to do that. There's not time to talk through that in detail today, but this is a very good resource to start with if you're thinking, I would really like to start improving ESC in my organisation and their ability to do compliance, then that tool's a good place to start. Okay, and just additionally, in terms of the tools that can be used to assist with things, the Water by Design guideline, again, besides the condition, it has some other elements as well. It includes an erosion sediment control plan checklist, so you can councils can use that if they want to check off on the kinds of ESC plans that are being submitted. It's just intended as an internal council resource, so it doesn't cover every possible issue. It just focuses on the ones with the greatest potential to pollute. So it's really an essential elements checklist, the kind of things that if they're not there, you've got really no chance of complying. It has the same categories as the standard conditions, so there's that line of sight between the condition requirements and what should be on the plan, and includes notes covering common issues with plans. It also includes a site orders checklist, which can be used for council or for private industry. And again, there's a direct link between the criteria in that checklist and the standard condition elements. So you've got that direct line of sight. The checklist has measurable and observable elements, and also includes a section on planning and adaptive management checks. So although a site doesn't need to be planning well and doing adaptive management, if it isn't and it has physical failures and pollution occurring on site, then that might inform the kind of enforcement response that's taken, because they're they're not doing all that they can. Okay, thanks for listening. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Leon. That was great. I guess coming from South Australia, some of those basins that you showed us had more water in them than we would get in an average year here in one of the driest places on the planet. So it's always good to see windows into other environments. Although we've had a huge peak in rainfall this week, and I think that front is moving through into Victoria at the moment. So I was just wondering about how many sites that are being developed across Adelaide at the moment had all of those sediment control systems all set up and ready to go in November for such a huge rainfall event. And I don't think I've ever seen a development with plot for sale signs that already had green grass growing out the front. So again, it's really good to see what's happening in other places and what's possible in terms of construction, civil works, making sure that sediment's not escaping off their allotments. So thank you. That's been really good. We just have someone's interested to know about, I guess, the chicken and the egg around compliance, policy, and education. I mean, you've been working in this space for a long time, obviously doing the education component, and then I noticed that the policy and those higher order documents are only just really newly released. So what's your thoughts on whether you need to start with the policy first and then build education and enforcement, or do you start with the capacity building, education enforcement, and then bring a policy in at the other end?
I think you can kind of do both simultaneously. You can have like an interim approach and then a bit of a longer term vision, I think. And I think that the policy is important long term, but as long as you have some heads of power in regulation or legislation currently, then you can take a short term approach and start getting some change on the ground straight away once you've got conditions on development permits. But until you have the expectation stated somewhere, whether it's in policy or guideline or conditions, it's very hard to start doing effective compliance or even education until it's really clearly identified what it is that you're trying to achieve. So setting those expectations in some ways is probably the very first starting point.
And what was the driver in Queensland really to sort of start
Yeah,
in this space? I mean,
good question.
obviously you have a lot of development and you have a lot of rainfall and a lot of good high quality watercourses. So is that where it came from, or is it from a different kind of
The big,
driver?
the big very first driver was in the early 2000s, and in southeast Queensland, they have this thing called the Waterway Health Card rating. So Healthy Land and Water produce a rating for all of the region's waterways annually, like an A, B, C, D, E, or F report card rating. And one of the big waterways up here, the Maroochy River, got a D rating, and it got people were really outraged about that because they have such high values for the waterway, and so that created the political environment where change was being driven from that highest level, and it really enabled people at an officer level to actually come up with things and start to do things to improve that.
Oh, awesome. It's good to know that, those sort of reviews of how ecosystems are sort of lead to something to improve their status. So, yeah. And there was a couple more questions around understand the regulatory system used to compel developers to deliver audits and erosion sediment control. They want to know who is the regulator. And I was also had that, was thinking about that as well in terms of your erosion control management plans and then being certified. So who plays the role in this space?
Sure. So in Queensland, there's two pieces of legislation that are generally used for erosion and sediment control. There's the Environmental Protection Act, and then also the Planning Act, and they are generally both administered by local governments, so the councils for the area, and they can choose which piece of legislation to do enforcement under. There's different tools under each of them. that does cause a bit of confusion for council sometimes about knowing which way to go. There's a bit of a wealth of tools in some situations, but the fines or the penalties are pretty good. Fines of up to $10,000 just from at an officer level through a pin, and for the most serious offences, so breaching an environmental protection order, for example, it's up to 2 years imprisonment. So the tools do have real teeth in Queensland. They're rarely used, but when I was running the compliance program at Sunshine Coast, we did do prosecutions, and it's relatively easy to prove the offences, and the courts are quite happy to impose penalties for them. So there are definitely good tools there, but it is up to the local governments, and that they're vastly different in terms of their technical capacity and political situation. So you do see quite a bit of variation.
Yeah, I was thinking about that in terms of like erosion soil control being a behavior change sort of piece of work. And in your experience, how long has it sort of taken for the behaviors to change? Or do you only seem to see that once enforcement has sort of occurred? And then the same, I guess, the same people seem to have learnt their lesson the hard way and then tend to change their practice.
Yeah, unfortunately, you only really see change once there starts to be enforcement. Um, but it doesn't mean you need to do enforcement on everyone. I think a lot of people in the industry, once they see that council is actually serious about it, they will come on board and voluntarily comply. But there needs to be a willingness to impose penalties, particularly for the people that are really recalcitrant, that have been afforded lots of opportunities, have been had to explain to them a number of times that all the enforcement options are on the table.
Yeah, interesting. Is the industry, were they part of the engagement to develop that tool document that you flashed up at the end there? Like I saw it was only
Mm.
it's only been recently released in 2023. So do you know much about the process to actually develop that?
Yes, yeah, I do. So it was taken. The initial work was taken for some work that I'd done for Gold Coast City Council, and was um, given to Water by Design to try and um, help start the conversation about having more consistency around local government. And then the process they went through was they got a number of industry experts to go over the document and workshop it and make modifications to it. So it started at that industry level, and then it went out to all the local governments in the southeast Queensland as well to provide feedback on, and went through more refinement as part of that process. So I went through quite a bit of consultation as part of that.
Great. Thank you, Leon. We will see you back again for the panelist discussion.